Welcome to The Big Question. I'm Angela Barnes, and today I'm joined by Sandra Särav, Estonia's Deputy Minister for Economy and Innovation. It's a pleasure to have you with us on The Big Question, Sandra. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, Estonia is really interesting to talk about when it comes to the digitalisation of public services. It was ranked 9th in the EU as well on the European Commission's 2022 Digital Economy and Society Index. But it's been quite the journey since 1991 when Estonia became fully independent again. So first of all, can you just talk me through, Sandra, the economy and infrastructure back in 1991 and how the country got to where it is now?
So just a little remark there. 9th we rank overall, but when it comes to offering public digital services, Estonia always ranks in top 3, as Estonia has 99% of all public services available digitally. So in 1991, Estonia regained its independence, and we had been illegally occupied by the Soviet Union for half a century. So for 5 decades, there was virtually zero economic growth. 1938, prior to the Soviet occupation, Estonia's economy was roughly the same as Finland's, which is our northern neighbor. Roughly, you could say that both Finland and Estonia had 2,500 international dollars GDP per capita. 1991, Estonia's GDP per capita was even lower than prior, than half a century earlier. So roughly 2,000 euros per capita. So you can imagine half a century of virtually no economic development compared to Finland, for instance, who had half a century to have economic focus and support. And their GDP per capita by 1991 was the same as Estonia's is today. So around 28,000 euros per capita GDP. So yes, this half a century didn't bring us any new developments. Our infrastructure was outdated. There was virtually no free economy. You know, it was a communist era in our history. So we had to have a fully fresh restart back in 1991. And luckily we had very young, fresh politicians at the time who thought that Estonia is going to need to do something different. And we did. Was
it necessary to build public infrastructure the way that you have done? And how do you think it has put Estonia ahead?
So half jokingly, we say that we were too poor to afford anything else, which is, in the same time, it's also a correct thing to say. So we skipped a lot of the steps that people were doing in the second half of the 20th century. So we went virtually from 1940 to the new era of technologies. We realized that we need to be efficient, which is one of the keys why Estonia is so digitalized in the first place. Digitalization brings you actually efficiency because you can do the same things with less resources, with less workforce. Estonia is only a country of 1.3 million people. You imagine we're not so big, but we don't like to be called tiny, we like being called compact. So we had to adopt digital systems in order to offer services in a more efficient way. The very first digital service that we had back in the year 2000 was actually tax declarations. So instead of queuing in line, we digitalized the service, and nowadays it takes less than 5 minutes to declare your taxes. So efficiency.
But the private sector hasn't subscribed in the same way, has it? Why do you think that is? Is it to do with the trust and digitalization or something else?
No, not at all. I mean, still, all of the companies are set up online. You cannot even set up a company, you know, physically on paper somewhere, and still all the taxes are declared online. But the use of digital technologies, I think, has to do with the fact that we have so many companies. As I mentioned, every 10th Estonian has their own company. 94% are micro companies. I mean, if you set up your ice cream booth somewhere for the summer, perhaps there's not so much to digitalize. So I think this is where the secret lays. Why we're not so digitalized in the business sector is because we have so many companies, and a large sum of them are small companies.
What do you think other EU member states could learn from how you have progressed and how you've digitalised completely your public services?
Well, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this on air, but Estonia has something called the Skype mafia. So Skype was set up initially in Estonia, and nobody uses Skype anymore, but it was very popular, you know, let's say 10 years ago, 7 years ago. And so Skype was set up in Estonia, and those guys who were the early guys and girls who were the early employees at Skype, they went on and they built their own startups and companies. And Estonia has 10 tech unicorns, which per capita is the most in Europe. And those people who built Skype then went to build on their own companies, and those companies of the first gen then went on and built their second gen companies, and now we're the third gen Skype companies. And this community is very, very tight. Estonia is a compact country, if you remember, so people talk to one another and they give advice, and this is a breeding ground for startups, if I may say so.
That's really impressive. 10 unicorns in Estonia,
Yes.
and that is impressive per capita. What does Estonia have to offer as well a foreign corporation wanting to set up a company in Estonia? I know you've given rise to globally successful companies like Bolt, Skype and Wise, to name a few.
It's the most competitive tax environment in the OECD countries for 6 or 7 years in a row already. We have 0% corporate tax on reinvested profits. So unless you take out dividends, as long as you reinvest, there's no corporate tax in Estonia, which is a competitive advantage. Estonia attracts a lot of capital per capita again. So we say per capita Estonia always wins. In the year 2022 alone, Estonian startups attracted 1.3 billion euros. And this was on average 6-7 times more than in Europe per capita.
So that's the e-residency card, is it?
E-residency card is similar to Estonia's national ID card. So national ID card in Estonia is mandatory. So what's e-residency is, we figured we can give access to Estonia's business environment with a similar type of digital ID. It's not your personal identity document. You cannot travel with it. However, you can access those Estonia's digital services. You can open up a company online wherever you're based in the world, and you can open up a company in Estonia in 15 minutes and 33 seconds, which is a world record. So of course, this is only if you do it regularly. If you're a newbie, it would take you a couple of hours, but still it's very efficient. You can fully declare your taxes online. You can provide digital signatures for documents. You can acquire property. You can acquire new companies without ever having to show up physically. And currently we have globally over 100,000 e-residents who have opened around 30,000 companies in Estonia. And they not only bring us economic benefit by paying some taxes in Estonia, but they employ locally. They bring new innovation to Estonia. So we're really happy with the e-residency project.
It sounds like a very appealing place then for startups to do business. And Estonia is relatively small, as we've said. Do you think that's made it easier to create digital services?
So both yes and no. It's made it easier because obviously you have only 1.3 million people. However, it's more difficult because as we started in 1991, we didn't have a lot of resources, meaning capital. So if you are a larger country, if you have more capital, it's easier to build the best systems possible. So we've always had to innovate and be more inspired with what we can do with the resources that we have.
That's great to get your insights on all of that. Sandra Särav, thank you ever so much for talking to us on The Big Question. It's been a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you so much for having me.